aren't there. Tell us how that works. You mentioned Parade Jerry, right there at the top of the draft board. When you're picking down in the first round like the Falcons were, do you start your draft board with guys that could be available at 24? Do you go ahead and say, okay, not realistic, but we'll put a Stafford, B.J. Raji, and those guys at the top to work down, or do you start with guys that are realistically going to be there outside of course, trading up to get them?
Well, that's a good question, and certainly, there's really two different, things. You have the guys that aren't going to be there, and in most cases, they're probably guys that you don't really need. Matt Stafford was not going to be a position the team was going to draft, so he probably wasn't at all in the conversation ever from the very beginning. But teams will rank players from top to bottom. Every player, every position, every school, they have a number on scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 7.5, 1 to 5. There's some different teams do it different ways in how they rank players and what number equals what round of grade. So everybody's ranked, and that helps you kind of do your own type of mock draft. And Thomas Dimitroff said that his pro personnel department will put together a pseudo mock draft where they'll kind of have an idea of where players may go based on other teams' needs, and that gives you an idea of who may be around in that 20 to 25 range. But when you're picking that low, you kind of have to be flexible. You have to see what's going to happen. But you rank everybody from top to bottom, and then you stack your draft board based on needs, based on, okay, defensive tackle, the value is here in round 1, the value's here in round 2, and then you just start, marking it off the list as you go along. So I think the team was very excited, though, because there was a lot of people, like I said, who didn't think Jerry would fall. I know I didn't think he would fall in the mock drafts that I had done, especially with some teams switching around and doing some different things in a 3-4 and needing linemen. You'd think Jerry might be able to fit in there. But he meets a need, and he's a guy who's probably going to come in and compete for a starting job right away next to Jonathan Babineau.
I was going to say, in the first round, really in the second round, in a lot of cases, those guys are expected to come in and almost start from day one, are they not?
They are, and when you look at last year's draft, 5 of the guys from last year's draft were starters, and that's including Chevis Jackson, who was a nickel back on defense, and Harry Douglas, who was the slot guy at wide receiver. If you loop those guys in as starters, and they played enough plays, certainly to be starters. That's 5 people. And second rounder was Curtis Lofton last year, and you saw what a great job he did on defense, coming in at what arguably could be the hardest position to play as a rookie, and that's middle linebacker, making the calls at the line of scrimmage and kind of directing the defense on where it needs to go. So the draft has been very, very good to the Falcons for 2 years in a row, and William Moore, the second-round pick who you talked about earlier, this is a guy who Thomas Dimitroff really likes, very fast, can run a 4.5, 4.4, even though he weighs 220 pounds, and he's a guy who slips into that position of need at safety and can come in and compete right away too. So not out of the question to think he could be this year's Curtis Lofton in that regard.
We're talking with J. Michael Moore, AtlantaFalcons.com. The middle of the draft was very intriguing to me, J. Mike, because, again, last year's draft almost exclusively players from major conferences, major colleges out there, and you see a lot of times there are the guys from the smaller conferences that can come up and play. You go San Jose State, hasn't been a football powerhouse to say the least. Then you get 2 FCS guys right there in the middle of the draft. Was that a little surprising, or are they just, because how do they factor in, I guess, the level of competition before you pull the trigger on a guy like that?
Yeah, well, it was certainly kind of surprising to us at AF.com when we go out and start looking for photos and stuff of these guys. It's kind of tough when they play these smaller schools. But, I asked Thomas and also Les Snead, director of Pro Personnel, and you can catch those videos on YouTube where I interviewed those. But I said, hey, the small school talent, where does that factor in? And they do consider it, but really this team was focusing so much this year on getting faster and getting stronger. And, you don't put all your eggs in one basket when it comes to measurables, but when you look at, Lawrence Sidbury, for example, the guy out of Richmond, defensive end, he ran the fastest 40 among defensive lines at the Combine. Well, you don't get any faster than that. And also ran the fastest 10, which is measuring how quickly you go 10 yards. And that's huge for a defensive lineman since they are going in 10-yard bursts and judging their explosiveness. So he certainly has the measurables to make an impact right away, depending on what type of situations the team puts him in. And the kid from San Jose State, Chris Owens, cornerback, has all the measurables to be a very good corner in the league. Thomas Dimitroff said in an event last night that He'll compete for a starting role. He's got that type of ability, and he really did well at the Senior Bowl. That's where he kind of lifted up the boards when you watched him at one-on-one drills against guys from major conferences. This is an all-star game. He's going up against SEC guys, Big 12 guys, teams that like to throw the football, and he just was, going out and taking care of business, getting picks in one-on-one drills, showing a lot of keen instincts. So that's where he started to go up the board there. So you take a lot of things into consideration, but small school, probably not a big concern here when you look at what they did in All-Star game. Sidbury, too, played in an All-Star game as well, I believe, the East-West game.
Again, it was just interesting to see. I know the fans, in a lot of cases, you've heard of a lot of the guys from the major colleges, and you get down to the FCS level, and I'm a big fan of that. I think they play good football, but a lot of times you wonder, Furman was about a mid-pack team in the SoCon. San Jose State, I believe they're in the WAC, if I have my geography correct.
You're correct.
Or down near the bottom, you wonder how much week-to-week top-notch quarterbacks and guys like that they might be facing.
You're right, and you do have to take that in consideration. I mean, Chris Owens especially, this is a guy who went 37 straight games and only had one touchdown thrown against him. And he said in his conference call with the media there were games that go by he wasn't thrown to at all. And when you think, okay, well, if this guy is the cream of the crop, the best, where nobody is even looking his direction, the Champ Bailey, if you will, of the WAC, Champ Bailey being a guy that teams just don't mess with most of the time when they play Denver, he's got something special. I think the team realized that right away. And the kid from Furman, William Middleton, that's a local guy. He went to Marist High School here in Atlanta. So the team is familiar with him, got to know him in the local visits because teams can bring in guys who live in their area for interviews and stuff like that. The rules are a little bit different. And again, speed. He's a guy that ran 4.4. So again, speed you can't teach, and it really, shows no boundaries when you go big conference, small conference. And will their heads be spinning a little bit when they get here? Probably. But, this is a coaching staff that has 218 years of NFL experience altogether. So they're going to be able to coach them up pretty well.
J. Michael Moore of AtlantaFalcons.com joining us here in the last really half of the draft. It looked like they did some depth building, to steal a phrase from Thomas Dimitroff, building through the draft. A guy that could come in and play some tackle for you, a reserve linebacker, maybe a guy you could groom into a starter in Spencer Adkins, and Vance Walker, who's obviously going to rotate there on the defensive line. Seems like they did some depth building there in the later rounds.
That's exactly right, and I think the team kind of addressed that specifically and said all of these guys will be able to provide immediate depth and possibly develop. Thomas Dimitroff said yesterday that Garrett Reynolds is a guy who actually could develop into a starting right tackle in the NFL. He's that good. And, I think that pick might have raised a few eyebrows because a lot of the experts said, he's not the most athletic person in the world, but he's tough, he's strong, he's big, 6'8", 315 pounds or 330, I can't remember right off the top of my head. And the offensive line coaches here, Paul Boudreau and Paul Dunn, would almost rather take that tough guy, the guy who plays through the whistle. When you look, that really defined the offensive line last year, especially on the right side with Tyson Clabo and Harvey Dawes. So lots of confidence in him there, and the coaches are really going to take care of him and develop him as a player. With Atkins coming out of Miami, a pass rush linebacker, another guy that could develop, but at first is probably going to be there to rush the passer out of that 4-3 set, and most guys like that are pretty good special teamers right out of the gate. And then Walker, as you said, a lot of people said that's probably a steal in the 7th round. Georgia Tech had some pretty good defensive linemen this year, and for him to be down there at number 7, a good pick to pick up, a pick the Falcons didn't have to begin this draft. They got it in a trade with Dallas, where they moved down in the 5th and picked up a 7th. So that could end up being a pretty good pick as well.
And then